Look around the world: Thailand, Myanmar, Pakistan, Sudan, Chile, Argentina. Open the pages of history or glance at the latest headlines and you will find countless countries where tanks have surrounded presidential palaces, where generals have appeared on television to announce the suspension of constitutions, and where governments chosen by the people have been toppled at gunpoint. Military coups, or coups d'etat, are among the most brutal and recurring realities of global politics. Now think of the United States, the nation with the most powerful, expensive, and technologically advanced military force in world history. Its fighter jets, aircraft carriers, and troops are deployed in every corner of the globe. The American military is so strong that in theory it could overthrow any elected government within hours, if it so desired, but in practice, it never has. In nearly 250 years of history, despite a devastating civil war, the United States has never experienced a successful military coup or even a serious conspiracy to attempt one. The very country often accused of orchestrating regime changes abroad has never seen its own government threatened by its military. Why? What invisible armor protects American democracy from its own soldiers? How did the nation's founders create a system ensuring that the sword would always remain subordinate to the pen? What institutional, cultural, and professional forces compel American generals to stay behind the fence and obey elected leaders? These are the complex historical questions we explore today. The deepest and most foundational reason lies in America's birth within the political philosophy of its founders. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison all were students of European history. They had seen how generals like Julius Caesar used their armies to seize power in the Roman Republic, and how figures like Oliver Cromwell overthrew elected governments in England. These examples inspired in them a profound distrust of any permanent, powerful military establishment. They believed that a large professional army was the greatest threat to republican liberty, for its power and discipline could easily turn an ambitious general into a tyrant. From this deep suspicion arose a brilliant and far-sighted design, a constitutional system that placed the military firmly under civilian control. According to Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution, the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces is the President, a civilian, elected leader, not a general or admiral. This means all military authority ultimately flows from an accountable politician. Any general who disobeys the President's orders commits outright treason. But the founders did not rely on the President alone to restrain the military. They divided power further. Under Article I, only Congress can declare war, even though that rule has often been bypassed in practice. More importantly, Congress controls the power of the purse. It alone can approve military budgets, set troop numbers, and allocate funds for weapons. The Constitution even specifies that no military appropriation may last more than 2 years, forcing the armed forces to remain dependent on the legislature for their survival and resources. The Second Amendment, today mostly debated over gun rights, originally stemmed from this same distrust. The founders envisioned a well-regulated militia of ordinary citizens as the foundation of national defense, believing that an armed citizenry would be the ultimate safeguard against tyranny and occupation. Though the militia later evolved into the modern National Guard, the underlying philosophy remained: diffuse military power among the people rather than centralize it. These constitutional guardrails, civilian leadership by the President, financial control by Congress, and distribution of power across federal and state levels created a structure that ensures the U.S. military remains an instrument of the state, never its master. Beyond law, America's armed forces are deliberately and intricately decentralized. Unlike in many nations where the military is a single centralized body, the U.S. military is divided into 6 separate branches: the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Space Force, and Coast Guard. Each has its own command hierarchy, budget, traditions, and institutional interests. Rivalries, sometimes healthy, sometimes not, have long existed among them. An army general could never easily coordinate with an admiral or Air Force chief for a coup. This compartmentalized structure makes any unified military rebellion almost inconceivable. Another unique pillar of this decentralization is the National Guard. It is not a purely federal force, but rather the militia of each individual state. Every state's guard answers first to its governor, not the president. Thus, there are 50 separate guard units under 50 governors, while the president can federalize them in Emergencies, they normally remain under state command. If federal troops ever revolted, state governors could deploy their guards to suppress the mutiny and ingenious diffusion of power outside Washington, D.C. Moreover, the U.S. has a vast network of armed agencies under civilian authority. The Department of Homeland Security, FBI, and many others. Add to that every state's police forces, county sheriffs, and local city departments, around 18,000 law enforcement agencies in total. This web ensures there is no single center of armed power. To execute a coup, conspirators would have to coordinate not just across military branches, but also against myriad independent state and local forces, a logistical impossibility. Stronger even than these structural barriers, however, is the invisible wall built within every soldier's mind, the wall of professional ethics, culture, and ideology. At world-class academies like West Point, Annapolis, and the Air Force Academy, cadets are not only taught tactics of war, they are imbued deeply with the principle of civilian control. They are taught that a soldier's job is not to set policy but to execute the policies of elected civilians. Their duty is to serve the nation, not to rule it. Every U.S. service member, from private to general, begins with an oath not to any president, commander, or party but to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The phrase domestic enemies is vital. It signifies that if anyone within government, no matter how high, violates the Constitution, the military's duty is to defend the Constitution itself, not the individual. This oath enshrines the military as an apolitical guardian of constitutional order. Deep within American culture lies the notion of American exceptionalism, the belief that the United States is unique because it is founded on liberty, democracy, and the rule of law. In this worldview, a military coup would not just be a political event, it would represent the death of the ideals that make America what it is. That belief is ingrained within the armed forces, where coups are viewed as unimaginable acts of betrayal. The U.S. military also mirrors the nation's diversity. Its members come from every class, race, religion, and political persuasion. This diversity prevents the rise of any single homogeneous faction that might see itself as the nation's true protector and seize power. This cultural software serves as the invisible force keeping the military within constitutional bounds. None of this means civil-military conflict has never occurred. On the contrary, U.S. history is filled with tensions between presidents and generals, but always resolved within constitutional limits, never at gunpoint. During the Civil War, Union Commander George B. McClellan clashed often with President Abraham Lincoln, criticizing his strategies and sometimes defying orders. Though he considered Lincoln unfit and even harbored presidential ambitions himself, McClellan never marched his troops on Washington. Lincoln ultimately used his lawful authority to remove him, proof that even amid war, civilian decisions prevail. In the Korean War, the legendary and widely revered General Douglas MacArthur publicly opposed President Harry Truman's policy of limiting the conflict. MacArthur advocated expanding the war, even using nuclear weapons against China, and publicly criticized the administration. In April 1951, Truman made a bold and controversial decision. He dismissed America's most famous general. Truman declared, "I fired him because he disobeyed the Constitution. I cannot allow U.S. foreign policy to be set by a theater commander." The moment became the strongest, clearest assertion of civilian supremacy in American history, proof that no general, however heroic, stands above the law. Later examples echo this pattern. During Vietnam, Pentagon officials clashed with the Johnson administration. In 2010, General Stanley McChrystal resigned after criticizing President Obama's team in a magazine interview. And during President Donald Trump's first term, reports revealed that Joint Chiefs Chairman General Mark Milley took steps to ensure nuclear control remained strictly within constitutional limits amid presidential turmoil. These episodes show that civil-military frictions persist, but always resolve through lawful means, not coups. Yet the 21st century United States faces new strains on this historic balance. Modern America is deeply polarized, Democrats and Republicans divided not only by policy but by culture and ideology. This polarization affects every institution, including the military. Soldiers are human. They too hold political beliefs. When political leaders brand one another as enemies and question democratic processes, the military's neutrality becomes harder to maintain. Public trust in democratic institutions, elections, courts, the press has sharply declined. Such erosion breeds dangerous temptations toward anti-democratic alternatives, including military intervention. Some politicians have even tried to politicize the military for partisan gain, using troops at rallies or involving generals in domestic debates, which undermines the apolitical ethos of the armed forces. When the military appears tied to one political faction, serving another becomes difficult, a perilous imbalance for civilian control. Meanwhile, the Pentagon acknowledges a rising infiltration of extremist groups, white supremacists, and other radical ideologues within the ranks. Though their numbers are small, they pose real threats to military unity and discipline. The January 6, 2021, Capitol attack was a stark reminder. Among the rioters were numerous military veterans and even some active duty members. Though not a coup and swiftly condemned by military leadership, the event revealed how deeply political fractures now penetrate society and even touch segments of the armed forces. These challenges do not mean a US coup is imminent, but they do suggest that the historical and cultural defenses that once made such an event unthinkable may no longer be entirely impervious.